There are moments in history when humanity seems to awaken from a long slumber, when the old ways of thinking no longer satisfy the questions burning within the human soul, when faith alone cannot answer the curiosity that stirs in the heart of mankind. The Age of Enlightenment was one such awakening, a period when light pierced through the heavy curtains of dogma, tradition, and authority, revealing a new world shaped by reason, science, and the power of human thought. Hello, and welcome to The Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The Age of Enlightenment, often simply called the Enlightenment, was not a single event or revolution. It was a slow-burning transformation of ideas that spread like a tide across Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, shifting minds, societies, and ultimately the course of the modern world. It was the age when reason became a guiding torch, illuminating fields once shrouded in superstition and authority. People began to ask, why must we obey? What is truth? Can we know the world through observation rather than revelation? The roots of this intellectual revolution can be traced back to the late Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed. The Renaissance had already reintroduced Europe to the humanism of ancient Greece and Rome, a celebration of the individual, of creativity, and of inquiry. Then, the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries challenged the medieval worldview that placed Earth at the center of the universe. Astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo had already shaken the heavens. Philosophers like Descartes and Bacon were now shaking the very foundations of knowledge itself. René Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am," introducing a method of doubt and rational inquiry that questioned everything except the certainty of one's own thinking mind. Meanwhile, Francis Bacon urged humanity to rely not on inherited belief, but on experiment and observation, to let evidence, not authority, guide knowledge. These ideas planted the seeds of the Enlightenment's greatest principle, that truth is discoverable by reason, and that every human being possesses the capacity to seek it. By the dawn of the 18th century, this new spirit had spread far beyond universities and laboratories. It reached coffeehouses in London, salons in Paris, and even the courts of kings. It flowed through pamphlets, essays, and letters, carried by thinkers who called themselves philosophes. They believed that knowledge should serve progress, that reason could liberate mankind from ignorance, tyranny, and superstition. Among them was Voltaire, perhaps the most famous voice of the Enlightenment. A sharp wit, a fierce critic of the church, and a tireless defender of free speech, Voltaire wielded his pen like a weapon. He ridiculed fanaticism and injustice, declaring, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." For Voltaire, freedom of thought was sacred, a light that no king or priest should ever extinguish. Meanwhile, Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered a very different perspective. While others praised reason and progress, Rousseau looked to the heart. He believed that civilization itself had corrupted humanity, that man was born free, yet everywhere he was in chains. His ideas on social contracts and the general will would inspire revolutions, most notably in France, where the cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity would echo through the streets of Paris. Across the Channel, John Locke redefined the nature of government and human rights. In his 2 treatises of government, he argued that authority was not divine, but contractual, that rulers derived power from the consent of the governed. Locke's vision of life, liberty, and property laid the groundwork for modern democracy and profoundly influenced the framers of the American Declaration of Independence. But the Enlightenment was not just about politics or philosophy. It was a new way of seeing the entire world. In science, Isaac Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation demonstrated that the universe operated according to consistent, discoverable principles. To many, Newton was the ultimate symbol of Enlightenment reason, a man who could explain the cosmos not through miracles, but through mathematics. The idea that the universe itself was rational inspired a new confidence in human capability. If the heavens obeyed laws, perhaps society could as well. If nature could be understood, perhaps so could human behavior. This was the birth of the social sciences, the study of man as part of nature, not apart from it. Coffee houses became the laboratories of public opinion. In cities like London, Edinburgh, and Paris, people from all walks of life gathered to debate politics, philosophy, and news. Newspapers and journals flourished, spreading ideas faster than ever before. Knowledge was no longer confined to universities or the church. It was becoming democratized. The encyclopedia, edited by Denis Diderot and Charles-Laurent d'Alembert, was the ultimate symbol of this intellectual revolution. Published between 1751 and 1772, it sought to gather all human knowledge into a single work, accessible to all. Its contributors included Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, among many others. Each entry was a small act of rebellion against ignorance and censorship, a declaration that knowledge belonged to everyone, not the privileged few. But not all Enlightenment anchors agreed on everything. Some, like Montesquieu, focused on government, arguing for the separation of powers to prevent tyranny. Others, like Adam Smith, applied reason to economics, proposing that free markets, guided by the invisible hand of competition, could produce prosperity without central control. The Enlightenment was, in truth, a tapestry of diverse ideas united with a common belief that reason, not tradition, should guide human affairs. Still, the light of reason cast long shadows. For all its talk of liberty and equality, the Enlightenment was also entangled with empire, slavery, and colonialism. Many European thinkers spoke of universal human rights while their nations profited from human bondage. Philosophers debated freedom while women, the poor, and non-Europeans remained excluded from the promises of progress. These contradictions would later fuel both revolution and reform, forcing future generations to confront the limits of Enlightenment ideals. At its heart, the Enlightenment was not about certainty. It was about the courage to question, to doubt, to investigate, to debate. It was a movement of mind and spirit that sought to replace fear with understanding. And though it began in Europe, its ripples reached far beyond, shaping revolutions in America, Haiti, and France, and influencing thinkers across Asia and the Middle East in the centuries to come. In salons hosted by powerful women like Madame Geoffrain and Madame de Staël, intellectuals gathered to exchange ideas freely. These salons were spaces where social hierarchies softened, where nobles and commoners, men and women, could engage in conversation as equals, at least for a night. Here, art and philosophy mingled, and the Enlightenment found its most human face, conversation itself, the sharing of thought without fear. It was in such spaces that the dream of a more rational, tolerant, and just world took shape. But outside those elegant rooms, the old powers were not yet ready to yield. The Catholic Church, monarchs, and conservative forces saw the Enlightenment as dangerous, even blasphemous. Books were banned, authors imprisoned, and pamphlets burned. Yet the fire of new ideas could not be contained. Like sparks in dry grass, they leapt from city to city, continent to continent, until they ignited revolutions that would remake the world. In England and Scotland, the Enlightenment took on a particularly pragmatic flavor. Figures like David Hume, Adam Smith, and Thomas Reid explored not only reason, but also human nature itself. Hume questioned the very foundations of knowledge, arguing that much of what we call reason rests on habit and experience. His skepticism challenged the certainty that others sought, reminding the Enlightenment that the human mind is both powerful and fallible. Meanwhile, Smith's The Wealth of Nations laid the foundation for modern economics, describing how individuals pursuing their own interests could, unintentionally, promote the good of society. It was a radical idea that the economy, like nature, could be understood through laws rather than decrees, through liberty rather than control.
In France, Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws offered another vision of order, one based on balance and moderation. He argued that power should be divided among branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, to prevent despotism. This principle would later shape constitutions around the world, from the United States to modern democracies everywhere. And then there was Immanuel Kant, a quiet Prussian philosopher who gave the Enlightenment its defining motto, sapere aude, dare to know. In his famous 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment?, Kant wrote that enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. To think for oneself, he said, is the essence of freedom. To use reason without guidance from another is to become truly human. It was a call to courage, not arrogant, to independence of mind, not rebellion for its own sake. For Kant, enlightenment was not a destination.
As the 18th century progressed, the Age of Enlightenment moved from being a purely intellectual movement into one that began reshaping societies. Ideas once confined to the pages of philosophical treatises and salon discussions started to influence laws, revolutions, and the structure of nations. What began as an age of reason was transforming into an age of action. The Enlightenment, though centered in Europe, was never bound by it. Ideas do not obey borders, and the flame of rational inquiry began to flicker in distant corners of the world. From the bustling streets of London and Paris to the libraries of Berlin, from the academies of Edinburgh to the halls of Philadelphia, a single question echoed: what does it mean to be free? In this period, political thought took on an urgency never seen before. Kings ruled by divine right, nobles enjoyed privilege by birth, and the Church claimed to interpret the will of God for all mankind. But now, the philosophers began to argue that power must come not from heaven, but from reason, and from the consent of the governed. John Locke's vision of government as a contract between ruler and ruled had already planted the idea of individual rights. But now, Baron de Montesquieu expanded on that foundation. In his Spirit of the Laws, 1748, he examined governments across the world and proposed that liberty could only exist when power was divided. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches, he argued, must check and balance each other so that no single authority could dominate. His theories would later form the very backbone of modern constitutional democracies. Meanwhile, Voltaire turned his biting wit against tyranny and intolerance. Through plays, letters, and essays, he mocked superstition and injustice wherever he found them, be it in the church, the monarchy, or even among fellow intellectuals. Those who can make you believe absurdities, he warned, can make you commit atrocities. To him, the right to think freely was not a luxury, but a moral duty. Voltaire's courage to speak truth to power made him a hero to many and a threat to rulers everywhere. Yet not all Enlightenment thinkers agreed with the same methods or conclusions. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a man of intense emotion and deep conviction, believed that reason alone was not enough. He distrusted the artificiality of civilization and argued that true freedom lay in returning to nature, listening not only to reason, but also to conscience and compassion. In The Social Contract, 1762, he wrote the words that would ignite revolutions. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. To Rousseau, society's laws should reflect the general will of the people, not the desires of monarchs or elites. The contrast between Voltaire's rationalism and Rousseau's romanticism symbolized the Enlightenment's inner diversity. It was not a single ideology, but a vast dialogue, sometimes a quarrel, between minds seeking truth. What united them was not agreement, but the shared conviction that human beings could shape their own destiny. In Paris, salons became the temples of this new religion of reason. Wealthy and educated women, often dismissed by traditional society, played a crucial role in nurturing these gatherings. Madame Geoffrin, one of the most famous salonières, opened her home to thinkers, artists, and politicians from across Europe.
Her salon was a place where ideas flowed as freely as wine, and where wit was as prized as wisdom. Madame de Staël would later continue this legacy, turning her salon into a bridge between the Enlightenment and the Romantic Age that followed. These women were not merely hosts, they were intellectuals in their own right. They curated debates, encouraged correspondence, and used their influence to protect writers from persecution. In doing so, they expanded the boundaries of who could participate in public thought. The Enlightenment, though still a product of a patriarchal age, was beginning to whisper the first words of equality. The scientific world was equally transformed. Isaac Newton's discoveries had already proven that the universe was governed by natural laws, not divine whims. But Enlightenment scientists and philosophers extended this logic to human society. Could there be natural laws of morality, politics, or economics, just as there were laws of motion and gravity? David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, brought a skeptical yet profound insight to this question. He suggested that human knowledge was limited not by divine decree, but by the nature of human experience itself. We could never truly know cause and effect in the metaphysical sense. We only observe patterns. For Hume, morality arose not from reason, but from feeling. Sympathy, he said, was the foundation of ethics, the ability to feel another's happiness or pain as one's own. This idea, that compassion is as vital as logic, would later influence modern psychology and ethics. In the same intellectual climate, Adam Smith, a friend of Hume, applied Enlightenment thinking to economics. In The Wealth of Nations, 1776, he described how individuals pursuing their own interests in a free market could unintentionally promote the good of society. It was a revolutionary idea that order could emerge from freedom, that wealth and prosperity did not require a controlling monarch, but could grow from voluntary exchange and competition. Smith's invisible hand became a metaphor for a new kind of harmony, one governed not by command, but by liberty. Meanwhile, Denis Diderot's Encyclopedia continued to challenge censorship and tradition. It was more than a book, it was a declaration of war against ignorance. Containing over 70,000 articles written by more than 140 contributors, it sought to document every aspect of human knowledge, from philosophy to science, from trades to arts. Diderot and his collaborators faced relentless opposition from the church and the monarchy, but they persisted. To them, spreading knowledge was the noblest form of rebellion. All things must be examined, debated, investigated, Diderot declared. We must dare to think for ourselves. In Germany, the Enlightenment took on a more philosophical tone. The movement known as the Aufklärung emphasized moral self-discipline and rationality. Its greatest voice, Immanuel Kant, synthesized reason and morality into a profound vision of human dignity. In his Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, Kant explored the limits of human understanding, showing that while we can never know things as they are in themselves, we can know the way our mind structures experience. But his greatest contribution lay in ethics. In Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, he proposed that moral worth arises not from results, but from intention, from acting out of duty according to universal moral law. His categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, became a cornerstone of modern moral philosophy. While Kant represented the intellectual summit of the Enlightenment, his contemporaries brought his ideas into the public sphere. Across Europe, rulers began to recognize that the age of divine right was fading. Some sought to adapt rather than resist. These became known as the enlightened despots, monarchs who embraced reforms inspired by reason but retained their power. Frederick the Great of Prussia modernized his administration, promoted religious tolerance, and corresponded with Voltaire. Catherine the Great of Russia invited philosophers to her court, founded schools, and sought to reform the legal system. Joseph II of Austria abolished serfdom and extended rights to religious minorities. These rulers believed they could use Enlightenment ideas to strengthen their states and improve society from above. But their reforms often faced resistance from entrenched nobles, from the church, and from the inertia of centuries-old systems. Still, they marked an important step, the recognition that reason could guide governance, not just theory. However, as ideas spread, they began to take on a life of their own, beyond the control of kings and philosophers alike. The American colonies, influenced by the writings of Locke and Montesquieu, began to imagine a world without monarchy at all. Across the Atlantic, pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, 1776, distilled Enlightenment philosophy into a call for independence. "The cause of America," Paine wrote, "is in great measure the cause of all mankind." When the Declaration of Independence was signed, its words echoed directly from the Enlightenment. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." It was the Enlightenment made flesh, a philosophy transformed into a political revolution. And yet, even this new world was not free of contradiction. The very nation founded on liberty still held slaves, and its vision of equality was limited to men of property. But the ideals had been spoken, and once released, they could not be silenced. Back in Europe, those same ideas were stirring deeper unrest. France, the cultural heart of the Enlightenment, was also its most glaring contradiction, a land of brilliance and misery, luxury and starvation. The philosophers had attacked inequality in books, now the people would attack it in the streets. By the end of the 18th century, the French Revolution would explode, turning the abstract dreams of liberty into violent reality. But before the storm broke, the Enlightenment reached its full flower, a moment when humanity believed it could reason its way to perfection. It was a time of great optimism, even idealism, when thinkers imagined a world governed by justice.
As the 18th century marched toward its final decades, the Enlightenment began to transform from a cultural and intellectual current into a social and political force that would reshape entire nations. What had begun as a movement of philosophers and writers now began to stir the hearts of ordinary men and women. Ideas, once confined to salons and printed pages, began to march in the streets. The notion that reason and human rights could govern society rather than divine right or inherited privilege had set the stage for revolution. Across Europe and across the Atlantic, the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, once abstract ideals, were starting to demand their place in the world. But as the Enlightenment's light grew brighter, so too did its shadows. In the American colonies, Enlightenment ideas had already given birth to a nation. The United States, established in 1776, was the first large-scale experiment in government founded on the principles of natural rights and social contract theory. Its constitution, influenced deeply by Locke, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, enshrined freedom of speech, religion, and the press, concepts that only a century earlier would have been unthinkable under the monarchies of Europe. Yet even as these ideals were celebrated, they carried contradictions. The same founding fathers who proclaimed that all men are created equal often owned slaves. Women were excluded from political participation, and indigenous peoples were displaced in the name of progress. Still, the birth of the United States marked a turning point. It demonstrated that Enlightenment philosophy could leap off the pages of books and take tangible form. A republic grounded not in divine authority, but in the sovereignty of its citizens. Europe watched with fascination and fear. Monarchs wondered if the same spirit that had crossed the Atlantic might soon cross their own borders. In the cafés of Paris, revolution was no longer an impossible dream. It was a topic of debate, of hope, and of dread. The air was electric with change. The philosophers themselves were divided. Some, like Voltaire, admired constitutional monarchy and favored reform over rebellion. Others, like Rousseau, saw revolution as inevitable, a necessary cleansing of corruption and inequality. The tension between reason and passion, order and freedom, now played out not in words, but in blood. By 1789, the storm broke. The French Revolution erupted, shaking not only France, but the entire world.
The Enlightenment had sown the seeds, and now those seeds burst forth into something vast and uncontrollable. The cry for liberty, equality, and fraternity echoed across Europe, tearing down the old structures of power. In the early days, the revolution seemed to embody the Enlightenment's highest ideals. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in August 1789, proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It called for freedom of speech, of religion, and for government by the consent of the governed. It was a document born of reason and faith in humanity's ability to govern itself. But revolutions, once begun, have a momentum of their own. The same Enlightenment that inspired tolerance also inspired radical certainty. In the name of reason, France would soon descend into terror. Philosophers who had dreamed of justice watched as guillotines rose in the city squares. The light that had once guided humanity now illuminated both its brilliance and its brutality. The Reign of Terror, led by figures like Robespierre, revealed the paradox of the Enlightenment's faith in reason, that even rational ideals could be twisted into instruments of tyranny when stripped of compassion. The same belief in human perfectibility that had driven progress could also justify the destruction of all who stood in the way. The Enlightenment had dreamed of freedom, but it had not foreseen how dangerous that dream could become when wielded without restraint. Yet even amid the chaos, the revolution transformed Europe forever. Feudal privileges were abolished. The church's power was curtailed. The idea that sovereignty rested with the people, an idea born from the pens of Enlightenment thinkers, became a permanent part of the human story. As France burned, other nations looked on. Some recoiled in horror, fearing that Enlightenment ideas had unleashed chaos. Others saw hope, that even the mightiest empires could not suppress the power of thought. Across the Atlantic, the American Revolution had proved the possibility of self-rule. Now, in Europe, that same possibility threatened to engulf monarchies from Spain to Russia. Ironically, it was a single man, Napoleon Bonaparte, who would carry the Enlightenment's ideals across Europe, even as he betrayed many of them. Rising from the ashes of revolution, Napoleon declared himself emperor, yet he governed by the logic of reform. His Napoleonic Code enshrined many Enlightenment principles: equality before the law, merit-based advancement, and secular government. He abolished feudalism, promoted education, and spread modern administrative systems wherever his armies marched. But Napoleon also embodied the Enlightenment's greatest contradiction: the belief that one rational mind, guided by reason and destiny, could reshape the world by sheer will. His empire, though born of revolutionary ideals, soon mirrored the authoritarianism it once opposed. In the end, Napoleon's rise and fall showed both the power and peril of Enlightenment ambition, the dream of reason becoming the tyranny of control. Meanwhile, outside of Europe, the Enlightenment's influence began to ripple across continents. In the colonies of Latin America, thinkers like Simón Bolívar drew inspiration from Rousseau and Montesquieu in their struggles for independence. In Haiti, enslaved Africans rose up in 1791, invoking the Enlightenment's own language of liberty and equality to demand their freedom. The Haitian Revolution, though often forgotten in European histories, was perhaps the purest realization of the Enlightenment's universal promise that all men, not just Europeans, deserve to be free. The ripple effects were immense. The world was awakening to the idea that freedom and equality were not gifts of birth or race, but natural rights belonging to all. Yet, even as these ideas spread, they met fierce resistance. The same Europe that spoke of liberty continued to profit from colonization, slavery, and exploitation. In this contradiction lay the Enlightenment's unfinished business, a promise only partly fulfilled. Back in Europe, the intellectual landscape was shifting once again. The Enlightenment had produced a confidence in reason so immense that it seemed the entire world could be measured, understood, and improved by rational inquiry. But now, thinkers began to question whether reason alone could explain the complexity of human life. Out of this doubt, a new movement began to stir: Romanticism. The Romantics were the children of the Enlightenment, yet they rebelled against its cold rationality. They believed that emotion, imagination, and nature held truths that logic could never reach. Where the Enlightenment had celebrated the power of the mind, Romanticism exalted the depth of the heart. Figures like William Wordsworth, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and Caspar David Friedrich turned their gaze from cities and science to mountains, forests, and human feeling. To them, the world was not merely a mechanism to be analyzed, but a mystery to be experienced. They did not reject reason entirely, but sought to balance it with wonder. In this sense, Romanticism was not the end of the Enlightenment, but its continuation by other means. A reminder that humanity needs not only light, but warmth. Still, the Enlightenment's legacy endured. Science continued to advance at an astonishing pace. The 18th century's experiments laid the foundation for the industrial and technological revolutions that would define the 19th and 20th centuries. Medicine, physics, and mathematics expanded far beyond the dreams of Newton or Bacon. The scientific method, empirical, skeptical, and systematic, became humanity's most powerful tool for understanding the natural world. And in politics, the Enlightenment had forever changed the relationship between people and power. Monarchs might return, revolutions might fail, but the idea of human rights could not be forgotten. Once men and women had tasted the freedom to think and speak, they could never again be silenced completely. Throughout the 19th century, reformers, abolitionists, feminists, and educators invoked the spirit of the Enlightenment as they fought for justice. Mary Wollstonecraft, who had written A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, became a pioneer of feminist thought, arguing that reason belonged equally to both sexes. Her voice, radical for its time, carried forward the unfinished promise of equality that the Enlightenment had only begun to imagine. Meanwhile, scientific societies, universities, and printing presses multiplied, making knowledge more accessible than ever before. The dream of the encyclopedia, the dream of gathering and sharing all human understanding, had taken root in libraries, academies, and schools across the world. The Enlightenment's belief in progress, education, and human potential became the moral foundation of modernity. And yet, there remained a lingering tension, a question that would haunt centuries to come. Can reason alone guarantee progress? The 19th and 20th centuries would test this question brutally, as industrialization brought both prosperity and suffering, as science unlocked both medicine and the machinery of war. The same rational mind that had conquered superstition would By the early 19th century, the world was no longer the same one into which the Enlightenment had been born. Empires had risen and fallen, revolutions had swept across continents, and the map of human thought had been redrawn. Yet the spirit of the Enlightenment, the belief in progress, reason, and the power of human understanding remained alive, shaping the foundations of modern civilization in ways both visible and invisible. In many ways, the Enlightenment had been a promise that humanity, through reason and knowledge, could free itself from ignorance and suffering. And though the 19th century brought new challenges, the legacy of that promise lived on in science, education, and the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality. The Industrial Revolution, for example, was not just an economic transformation. It was the practical expression of Enlightenment principles. The belief that nature could be studied, understood, and harnessed for human benefit had given birth to machines, factories, and inventions that reshaped the world. Steam engines powered ships across oceans, railways connected distant lands, and industries rose from the fusion of empirical science and mechanical ingenuity. Humanity, for the first time, seemed to be mastering the forces of nature. But this new mastery came with a heavy price. Cities swelled with workers, their lives often consumed by labor in the dark and dangerous mills of progress. The same reason that had promised liberation now seemed to have chained millions to the gears of industry. Philosophers and writers began to ask whether the Enlightenment's vision of progress had gone astray. Was it enough to understand the laws of nature if those laws were used to exploit rather than uplift? Could reason alone guide morality in a world driven by profit? In this questioning, the Romantic movement found its strength. Poets and artists sought to remind the world of what it was in danger of forgetting, that human beings were not machines, that beauty and emotion were as essential as logic and science. William Wordsworth, wandering the English countryside, wrote of nature as a teacher of the soul. Mary Shelley, in her haunting novel Frankenstein, warned of what happens when science loses sight of its humanity. And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, in Faust, told the story of a man who trades his soul for knowledge, a parable for the dangers of unrestrained ambition. The Enlightenment had celebrated the light of reason, but now Romanticism reintroduced the shadows, the mysteries, passions, and moral complexities that reason could not fully explain. And yet, even this rebellion was born of the same intellectual soil. The Romantics were not enemies of the Enlightenment, they were its conscience, reminding humanity that wisdom lies not in the mind alone, but in the heart as well. Meanwhile, across Europe and beyond, the Enlightenment's political legacy continued to unfold. The revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality inspired new movements for national self-determination. In Latin America, leaders such as Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Bernardo O'Higgins fought for independence from colonial rule, guided by the principles of freedom and justice that had once inspired America and France. In Greece, patriots rose against Ottoman domination. Across Europe, the old order was crumbling piece by piece as the idea of human rights spread like fire in the dry grass of empire. Education, too, became one of the Enlightenment's most enduring gifts. Before this period, learning had been the privilege of the elite, confined to monasteries and universities. But now, governments and reformers across Europe began to see education as a public necessity. Schools were founded, literacy increased, and libraries opened their doors to ordinary citizens. Knowledge, once guarded, was now being shared. The dream of Diderot's encyclopedia to make the sum of human understanding accessible to all was coming true. The scientific institutions born during the Enlightenment continued to expand. The Royal Society, Académie des Sciences, and other academies became hubs of innovation. Medicine advanced as researchers discovered vaccines and understood disease through observation rather than superstition. The work of Edward Jenner, who developed the smallpox vaccine in 1796, marked one of the first triumphs of Enlightenment medicine, a concrete demonstration that human suffering could be alleviated through scientific inquiry. And yet, as humanity reached for the stars of progress, it continued to stumble over its own shadows. The 19th century was also an age of imperialism, when the same nations that had preached liberty and equality expanded empires built on domination and exploitation. Enlightenment rationality, when stripped of compassion, was sometimes used to justify conquest. Colonial administrators spoke of civilizing missions, claiming to bring progress to those they deemed primitive. In truth, they often brought oppression. This dark underside of the Enlightenment revealed itself most painfully in the pseudosciences that arose in the 19th century: racial classifications, eugenics, and the misuse of biology to justify inequality. The same tools of observation and measurement that had once liberated humanity from superstition were now used to construct new hierarchies. It was a grim reminder that knowledge, when divorced from ethics, can become as dangerous as ignorance. Still, within these contradictions, progress continued. The abolitionist movements that swept through Europe and the Americas were rooted in Enlightenment ideals of universal rights. Thinkers and activists such as William Wilberforce, Frederick Douglass, and Toussaint Louverture invoked reason, morality, and the shared humanity of all people to challenge the institution of slavery. Their victories were hard-won, but each represented a step toward realizing the Enlightenment's unfinished dream of equality. In the realm of thought, the Enlightenment's influence continued to evolve through new schools of philosophy. Auguste Comte developed positivism, the belief that knowledge should be based on empirical observation and scientific reasoning. Meanwhile, John Stuart Mill expanded the idea of liberty into new territories, arguing not only for political freedom, but for freedom of expression, individuality, and gender equality. His book on Liberty, 1859, remains one of the most powerful defenses of human autonomy ever written. Mill's ideas, along with those of Mary Wollstonecraft and later Harriet Taylor Mill, laid the groundwork for early feminism. These thinkers argued that women, no less than men, were rational beings entitled to education, independence, and participation in public life. The Enlightenment had spoken of man as the measure of reason, but now its own logic demanded that it include all of humanity. The struggle for women's rights would continue into the centuries ahead, fueled by the same light of reason that had once challenged kings. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Enlightenment's influence found me everywhere. In the courts that upheld constitutional law, in the laboratories that chased new discoveries, in the movements that demanded justice and democracy. The modern world, in all its complexity, was the child of this intellectual revolution. But it was also a child that would one day test its parents' faith. For if the Enlightenment had believed that reason could perfect humanity, the 20th century would expose how fragile that faith could be. The rise of totalitarian regimes, the horrors of 2 world wars, and the invention of weapons capable of annihilating entire cities would force humanity to confront the limits of its own enlightenment. Still, even in the darkest times, the ideals of the 18th century endured. When fascism and tyranny rose, people again invoked the language of liberty and reason. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, echoed the Enlightenment spirit when it declared that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Though the Enlightenment had begun as a European movement, its legacy had become global, a moral compass for all who sought freedom and justice. The Enlightenment also laid the intellectual groundwork for the modern scientific and technological revolutions that would follow. From the discovery of electricity to the birth of the internet, from the theory of evolution to the exploration of space, every step of human progress owed something to that age's insistence on observation, experimentation, and critical thinking. The methods of Newton and Bacon, the curiosity of Diderot and Galileo, the skepticism of Hume, all became part of the DNA of modern science. In philosophy, too, the Enlightenment's echoes continued to sound. The question of how humans know and what they should do, first framed by Descartes, Locke, and Kant, remains at the heart of modern thought. Existentialists, pragmatists, and even postmodernists, whether they opposed or extended its ideas, could not escape its influence. To think at all in the modern world was, in some sense, to think in the shadow of the Enlightenment. And beyond philosophy, its moral and political vision persisted. The democratic revolutions of the 20th century in India, South Africa, Eastern Europe, and beyond are all in spirit children of the Enlightenment. Wherever people demanded freedom of speech, equality before the law, or education for all, the flame of the Enlightenment burned anew. It is easy, in hindsight, to see the Enlightenment as inevitable, as if humanity was destined to rise from darkness into light. But in truth, it was a fragile victory. It succeeded because countless men and women dared to question, to doubt, to risk persecution for the sake of truth. The books they wrote, the experiments they conducted, the debates they held, each was an act of courage. They believed that ideas could change the world, and they were right. Perhaps the greatest gift of the Enlightenment is not any particular discovery or doctrine, but the habit of questioning itself. The refusal to accept authority without evidence, to confuse belief with fact, to stop learning.
The legacy of the Enlightenment stretches far beyond the pages of philosophy and history. It lives within us, woven into the fabric of how we think, speak, and dream about the future. Every time we question a long-held belief, seek evidence before accepting a claim, or stand up for the rights of another, we are echoing the spirit of that age when humankind dared to think for itself. To understand the Enlightenment is to understand the modern mind. Before it, the world was governed largely by faith and tradition, by kings and clerics who claimed divine authority. After it, humanity began to see itself as capable of shaping its own destiny. The shift was not only intellectual, but existential. It redefined what it meant to be human, no longer subjects of fate, but participants in the unfolding of history.
In the centuries that followed, that sense of agency became both humanity's greatest strength and its greatest trial. The same rationality that drove scientific discovery also gave rise to machines of destruction. The same curiosity that reached into the heavens also probed into the atom, unlocking forces powerful enough to unmake creation. The Enlightenment had given us knowledge. What it could not guarantee was wisdom. And so every generation since has faced the same question: how should we use the power that understanding gives us? When we look at the world today, with its vast networks of information, its wonders of technology, its political freedoms hard-won and still fragile, we are witnessing the continuing experiment of the Enlightenment. The Internet, for example, is in many ways the digital descendant of Diderot's encyclopedia, an ever-expanding library of human knowledge available to anyone with curiosity and connection. But it also carries the same dangers that haunted the philosophers: the spread of falsehood, the manipulation of truth, the temptation to mistake information for understanding. The Enlightenment taught us that truth requires effort. It must be questioned, tested, and refined. Freedom of thought means nothing if we do not also cultivate discipline of thought. In that sense, the project of enlightenment was never meant to end. It is an ongoing dialogue between knowledge and conscience, between what we can do and what we should do. Around the world, nations still wrestle with the same paradoxes that stirred in the coffee houses of London and the salons of Paris. How much freedom can a society bear before it fragments? How much order can it impose before it becomes tyranny? What responsibilities accompany the right to think and speak freely? These were the questions of Voltaire and Rousseau, of Locke and Kant, and they remain the questions of our own age. In classrooms, in parliaments, in laboratories, the Enlightenment lives on. Its methods, the reliance on evidence, the testing of hypotheses, the openness to debate have become the foundation of every field from medicine to engineering. Its moral insights, the equality of persons, the dignity of reason, the belief in progress, inform our laws, our constitutions, and our ideals. The very language of human rights owes its rhythm to the Enlightenment's conviction that every person, by virtue of being human, deserves respect. But to preserve those ideals, we must also remember their cost. Many of the original thinkers faced persecution, exile, or ruin. Galileo was forced to recant. Voltaire spent years in prison and banishment. Diderot's encyclopedia was censored and confiscated. These were not victories of comfort, but of conviction. Their courage reminds us that enlightenment is never granted. It is fought for, defended, and renewed. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of the word, enlightenment. It is not merely a historical era, it is a process of awakening. It is the moment when darkness meets light, when the familiar gives way to the unknown, and when the human mind refuses to accept limits set by fear. It is a movement not just of centuries, but of consciousness itself. Thinkers like Kant and Hume understood this deeply. They knew that reason was not a weapon to destroy faith or tradition, but a compass to navigate the vast ocean of existence. Kant's call to sapere aude, dare to know, was not an invitation to arrogance, but to responsibility. To know is to act with care. To understand is to be accountable for what we do with that understanding. The Enlightenment story, then, is not just the story of Europe or the 18th century. It is the story of humanity learning to trust its own light. And that light has guided every great movement for justice and equality since, from the abolition of slavery to the fight for women's suffrage, from the civil rights movement to the defense of democracy in our time. Each generation has had to rekindle it, to keep it burning against the winds of ignorance, prejudice, and fear. Yet there is another truth. Enlightenment is never complete. It is not a state we achieve once and for all, but a balance we must constantly maintain. Too much faith in reason, and we risk forgetting our humanity. Too little, and we slide back into superstition and tyranny. The challenge of the Enlightenment is eternal: to think deeply without becoming cold, to feel deeply without losing clarity. If the thinkers of the 18th century could look upon our world now, they might be astonished. They would see their dreams made manifest in ways they could hardly imagine: universal education, democratic governance, scientific marvels that have mapped the stars and decoded the genome. But they would also see the same struggles they once faced: misinformation disguised as truth, fanaticism rising from the ashes, and inequality persisting despite prosperity. They would recognize, perhaps with a sigh, that enlightenment is not a destination, but a journey. In that sense, the Age of Enlightenment never truly ended. Its light flickers in every act of curiosity, every question that begins with why, every protest against injustice, every discovery that expands the horizon of what is possible. Its echo resounds in classrooms where young minds learn to think critically, in laboratories where scientists chase understanding, in courts where justice seeks reason over revenge. The challenge for us, the inheritors of this legacy, is to ensure that light does not fade. We live in an era of unprecedented knowledge and communication, yet also of deep confusion and division. The same technologies that connect us can isolate us. The same data that enlightens can overwhelm. More than ever, we must practice the humility of reason, to listen, to doubt, to learn anew. The Enlightenment reminds us that progress is not inevitable. It is a choice, made daily by each of us in how we think and how we act. It asks us to reject blind certainty, to cherish evidence, and to pair intelligence with compassion. In doing so, we continue the work that began centuries ago, when a few brave souls dared to question everything, and in doing so, illuminated the world. So, when we speak of the Enlightenment, we are not speaking only of history. We are speaking of ourselves, of our endless search for meaning, truth, and a better future. We are the continuation of that light. The torch has passed from Voltaire's pen to our screens, from Rousseau's voice to our classrooms, from Newton's telescope to our satellites. The tools have changed, but the spirit remains the same. Because in the end, the Enlightenment was never just about knowledge, it was hope. Hope that the human mind could rise above fear. Hope that reason could overcome tyranny. Hope that truth could outlast deception. It is that hope that carried the world from the shadows of the past into the dawn of modernity. And as we close this journey through the Age of Enlightenment, remember that the light it kindled burns not in books or monuments, but in minds, in yours, in mine, in every heart that dares to think freely and feel deeply. For enlightenment is not the triumph of reason over faith or science over art. It is the harmony of all human faculties, the mind, the heart, and the spirit, working together toward understanding. And as long as we keep questioning, learning, and seeking truth, the Age of Enlightenment will never truly end. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.